if our speaker would like me to, I can commence. I can commence
Give
things.
me 2 more. Actually, 10 more seconds.
10 more seconds. So 10 more seconds. That being said, Pusey House also has a scriptorium in Oxford, an Oxford scriptorium, which is 3 days a week, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, from prayer together in the morning, 4 sessions in the library throughout the day, and then in the evening you tell everyone what you tried to do. Jack Chisnall here, Mr. Jack Chisnall runs it. There's a free lunch midday. You can come and go as you please. There's coffee hours in between periods of intense study of whatever you want. It's a good way to get work done, to avoid the procrastination that is always eating away at us. I'm a famous procrastinator, you know, a tomorrower, a manana man. So it's a wonderful way to get things done. And we still have space. We're not at capacity in the beautiful library upstairs, which, by the way, is open 9:30 a.m. until 5:25 p.m. Monday through Friday, inside and, Father George, outside of term time. Is that right?
Yeah.
Same hours. It's open to any and all. And Jessica, our wonderful librarian, will greet you on entry and show you where you might sit. Questions? Concerns? Toilets are downstairs should you need them at any time. We will end promptly at 25 past the next hour, when you're welcome to come to evening prayer with us in the chapel. Have I exhausted 10 seconds?
You have exhausted 10 seconds.
Should I exhaust more?
No. I just realized
Should
I'm
I
not
exhaust
sitting
them?
in front of this. I don't
Should I
know when the
exhaust
next
them?
slide comes. Yeah, exactly. I defend myself by saying that Jonathan told me that I shouldn't sit and rather stand. And this is
Everyone's using these defenses. The Jonathan told me defense.
It's a perfect defense. Jonathan told me to do
Yes,
it.
Jonathan told me. So I would like to, without further ado, I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker this evening, and that is Isabelle Heinemann. And Isabelle is doing her MPhil in intellectual history at St. Hilda's College. That's in Oxford. And what she's going to present, well, some people actually
It's
ask.
in Cowley, to be fair. It's not quite in Oxford.
Sometimes someone says I'm at a college, and you scratch your head and you say, oh, that might actually be a college, right? But not St. Hilda's case. St. Cat's we often wish weren't architecturally. But these lectures that we've invited her to participate in, the Recollection series, are meant to recall us to the great ideas and the great persons or personages of Christian history, but from the perspective of scholars of our university and further afield, and Dante is one of them, and it fits right in. Secondly, this is co-sponsored by Pusey Center for Theology, Law and Culture, which is trying to engage questions of our age with the wisdom of all ages. And this touches on Dante, but it also touches on empire, a question which is at the fore of current politics, with Russia deciding how big it wants its empire to be, perhaps as we speak. Yeah. Now, I've been told, I have it on good authority from the author herself, that this might be a DPhil in space. The topics here. It's not her MPhil topic, but it is perhaps a DPhil in space, and we're honored to receive it in its early form, and to hopefully ask you questions that will bring the research along. That being said, Isabelle is also a middle reader at the Canterbury Institute, and that's if you don't know what that is, you look that up. It supports the intellectual vocation, humility, and an approach of the truth. And I think that being said, I have no more to add except to turn it over to you for the next 50 or so minutes of lecture. Thank you.
For I dipped into the future far as human eye could see, saw the vision of the world and all the wonders that would be, till the war drum throbbed no longer and the battle flags were furled. In the parliament of man, the federation of the world, there the common sense of most shall hold a fretful realm in all, and the kindly earth shall slumber, lapped in universal law. That's Tennyson's Locksley Hall from 1837, one of the most wonderful summaries of the universal theme in modern poetry. And incidentally, something that, as per anecdote, was crumpled up in Harry Truman's pockets at the San Francisco Conference, the foundation of the modern United Nations, a purveyor of universal law, or at least one that aspires to be. This is maybe an odd intro for a historical talk, as some of you may think. And on the other hand, some of what you will hear will be an odd enumeration on themes for those who are expecting a talk on contemporary political theory. Because it is intellectual history, so we cannot quite leave the present behind when we travel back into the past. I come to this from an angle of someone who's studied international relations before, current affairs, and has encountered the problem of global governance in many ways, which usually is said to go back in international relations theory to Kant's perpetual peace, but not really much further. It isn't really very well investigated where these ideas originated beyond Kant's perpetual peace. And this whole research project has come out of that idea of filling that up. It is particularly relevant today, not just because of empire as we understand it today, which I think Jonathan alluded to, imperial hunger for conquest, but rather actually because of what I see as the discrepancy between ambition and reality in the provision of global governance. So actually, when I'm thinking of empire, I'm thinking much more of European Union, United Nations, and NATO, or the Western world, as it's often called, rather than Russia's local expansions. Because we expect from these institutions a certain kind of governance and addressing issues, or if not preventing them, so at least mitigating them, such as financial crises, protecting residents from governmental abuse, responsibility to protect, mitigating, adapting to climate change, making sure that there will be less tax evasion, all these aspects of governance, without giving them the tools to do so, without actually making these institutions imperial in their monopoly on violence. Because meanwhile, global economic, cultural, and social interdependence are increasingly an inescapable reality. It's not really a question of do we want to be global or do we want to be local, but rather how do we address having become global? And that is why, to me, it seems very interesting to go back to the origins of these ideas that are at the foundation of our modern international institutions and to investigate them. Because as Isabelle said, intellectual history should be relevant both to the modern world and to the human condition in general. It should be a two-pronged approach. You should read texts both to understand them and how other people read them, but also maybe because, to not draw Chesterton's ire, or was it C.S. Lewis, for chronological snobbery, rather looking at the texts actually thinking they might still be able to teach us something. Now, Dante Alighieri, after this long-winded introduction, as probably most people know, lived 7 centuries ago. But not only his poetical genius, but also his political thought remains strikingly relevant to these questions that I've just illuminated. Whenever we ponder whether the universal can be anything but imperial in modern talks on global governance, we are actually posing exactly the obverse of the question that Dante Alighieri posed in the treatise De Monarchia, namely whether the imperial can be anything but universal. While at the time of its writing, this treatise primarily weighed in on a very practical struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor for supremacy in Italy, Dante's novel approach to legitimacy enjoyed a varied reception far beyond its time and place, and it now constitutes one of the most important roots of the genealogy of what I call the twin ideas of universal peace and universal empire in Western thought. Jonathan has mentioned that this is an ongoing research project, that it is a DPhil in spe, and the focus is very much on in spe, so I ask your kind understanding for lacunae in the research so far, and hope that you'll nevertheless ask incisive and merciless questions that will draw out the best in further research. And I'm grateful for the opportunity to Pusey House to give this lecture, and grateful that you've all turned up. As for Dante Alighieri, to maybe start with some biographical notes, because I hear that this is a non-specialist audience. Should this be a specialist audience and this all be terribly boring to you, feel free to interrupt me. You have to show some pity, in a sense, for Dante's biographers, because on one hand, he is an incredibly known poet, but on the other hand, we know so very little about his actual private personal life that isn't communicated through his own writing. So in a sense, any biography of Dante has autobiographical aspects. And much of the chaotic itinerary of his 2 decades in exile remains shrouded in mystery. On the other hand, the details that he offers in the Divine Comedy and in the Symposium about his private life have mesmerized biographers, beginning with Boccaccio already, who wrote a biography of Dante, and led them down rabbit holes, devoid of real-world certainty, and inviting endless speculation. It tends to kind of burnish the legend of this ever elusive subject. So the biographer must choose either to hew out the evidence and ferret whatever about Dante's life they can uncover, or to surrender to the genius of the work and just write about Dante the poet rather than the man, hiding behind these 14,233 verses of the Divine Comedy. But to give some background, I think it is mostly very important to understand three aspects of the political and cultural world of Italy in the at the turn of the Trecento, at the turn of the 13th to the 14th century in Italy. The first is the conflict between the Ghibellines and the Galves. Now, if these terms may be familiar to most people here, or they may not be, they ultimately denote parties in Italy at the time of a conflict that originally grew out of the investiture controversy. You might have heard of, Canossa, the emperor had to beg the Pope for forgiveness at the apex of this controversy. And then these parties ossified in Italy when the succession of the Salian dynasty of the Holy Roman Empire was contested between the Welfs of Bavaria, hence the name Gelf, and the Staufers of a place called Weblingen, hence the name Ghibelline, Italian understanding of German terms. The peak of the conflict is usually seen at the time of the Staufen, when Frederick Barbarossa had his great incursions into Lombardy, when Frederick II, Stupor Mundi, finished his encirclement of the papacy through the Norman Sicilian inheritance, which we have amazing artwork coming to us in Palermo, so we should be grateful for it. But overall, this was a localized universal conflict. So every Italian city had its own Guelph and Ghibelline parties. Often the Guelphs tended to be more mercantile, more bourgeois, you could say. The Ghibellines tended to be more feudal, but that by no means holds as a universal truth. However, Florence at the time had the Ghibelline party in Florence at the time had suffered a final defeat in 1289, and you will note with irony later on, or already if you know a bit about Dante's work, that Dante in 1289 at this Battle of Campaldino was a young gentleman, 24 years old, fighting for the Guelph party, therefore for the papal party. After this victory, because I suppose nature abhors a vacuum, the Guelphs within Florence divided into two factions. The Guelfi Bianchi, the white Guelphs, to which Dante belonged, simply per family allegiance, and the Guelfi Neri. And that again morphed into an opposing view of the papal role in Florentine affairs. Then the whites end up expelling the blacks, and in response the Pope ends up threatening Florence. So Dante was journeying at the time to be a delegate for his party, for the white Guelphs, to the Pope, when the Pope had just invited Charles of Valois, a French prince, brother of the king, to visit Florence because the Pope had appointed him peacemaker of Tuscany. But the city's government had allegedly treated the Pope's ambassadors badly a few weeks before, seeking independence from papal influence, and it was believed that Charles of Valois had received rather unofficial instructions to possibly occupy Florence, and that's why the Florentine Council, the white Guelphs, sent a delegation to Rome, among them Dante. Now, there's an interesting irony here, and something that I couldn't actually make out of the sources is how the Florentines could possibly think that Charles of Valois was in league with the Pope, because at the same time, the Pope, of course, was in the midst of a titanic struggle with the French king, of which you might have heard if you heard of the bull Unam Sanctam. We'll get into that later. So there must have been a misunderstanding here on one of the sides, but it didn't matter in the end, because Dante was an ambassador in Rome, and even though his ambassador, in a sense, was successful, at that time, Charles of Valois, then in Florence, was entertained by the Black Guelphs, the opposing party. They destroyed much of the city and killed many of the white Guelphs, and Dante was exiled. In the words of Machiavelli, who sums this up very nicely in his History of Florence, both parties being in arms, the Signoria, one of whom at the time was the poet Dante, took courage, and from his advice and prudence caused the people to rise for the preservation of order. And being joined by many from the country, they compelled the leaders of both parties to lay aside their arms and banished Corso with many of the blacks. And as an evidence of the impartiality of their motives, they also banished many of the Bianchi, the whites, who ever soon afterward, under pretense of some justifiable cause, returned. So Machiavelli kind of glosses over that and says it wasn't as big a deal, but for Dante it was a very big deal because the new Black Guelph government exiled him on basically fabricated accusations of corruption and financial wrongdoing while he was still in Rome at the Pope's, and he never managed to return for the rest of his life, which was a good 20 years. This all happened in 1302. Now, Dante was in perpetual exile until 2008, when finally the government of Florence, the city council, passed a motion rescinding that sentence and celebrated an interment of what was believed to be a part of the poet's bones to honor that occasion. He spent the rest of that exile moving from different Italian cities to different Italian cities. We'll not get too much into that because it's not too relevant for the treatise, but you will maybe understand why someone who suffered such personal misfortune at the hands of internecine squabble was amenable and increasingly later in his life turned towards the idea of universal empire as an alternative to this squabble. There is, however, another piece of context that I think is important to understand and which some commentators of the Monarchia seem to gloss over, is that in 1309 we also have the move of the papacy from Rome to Avignon as part of what I just mentioned, the essential outcome, the victory of Philip IV in his struggle with Boniface VIII, the Pope at the time, over the question of the taxation of church property in France. So you might have heard of the bull Unam Sanctam that I already mentioned, and the slap of Anagni, the famous event in which henchmen hired by the French king slapped Pope Boniface in Anagni so harshly that he died a few days later. I can't really have been a slap, it must have been something else, but it's known as the slap of Anagni. And in succession then, the new Pope Clement, who is in scholarship usually interpreted as a puppet of the French, moved to Avignon, where they were supposed to remain for 100 years. However, it's been re-evaluated in modern scholarship whether we should really see the move to Avignon as all of these popes being puppets of the French monarchy, because at the same time we actually see within the church an ambitious process of centralization and institutional bureaucracy that keeps swelling, and a straightforward exercise of power by the Avignonese Pope, more than we had actually seen from Rome. And also in Rome, of course, the popes were just as much beholden to local families, the Orsini and others, and therefore it has been challenged whether Avignon was really the Babylon of the West, as Petrarch put it, when he says there is only one hope of salvation in this place, here Christ is sold for gold, talking about Avignon. But for Dante, this must have been a very significant event because, as we've just heard, it was the arrival of Charles of Valois at the behest of the French king that led to his expulsion from Florence. And to then see the papacy as a believing Catholic moving to France and becoming what must to him have looked like the puppets of French kings must have ossified his opposition to this particular succession of popes, which we'll get into later. Politically, Dante wasn't personally active anymore during his 20 years of exile, but he intervened nevertheless in politically through his writing, and thus it was probably around 1310 when Henry VII of Luxembourg, the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, set up for Rome with the Pope's approval to restore peace in Italy, that Dante started becoming, for all intents and purposes, even though he himself claimed he didn't belong to any party, a Ghibelline. Namely, he started writing letters to princes and people of Italy, asking them to welcome Henry as a priest bringer. Some of those survive, of others we just know because they are noted by the chronicles. And it's also during this time that he must have started to write the treatise De Monarchia, in which he urged everyone to accept the emperor as the temporal sovereign who could unite the world under one rule of law. The Divina Commedia, the masterpiece that you're familiar with, was likewise written over a long period of time during his exile in different places, and was completed only shortly before his death in 1321 of a fever which he caught in one of these diplomatic missions. Now, the other interesting background of this time next to the Avignon papacy that I'd like people to keep in mind is, of course, the end of the Crusades, or at least of what we would call the main body of the Crusades, namely in 1291 when Acre, the last holdout of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, fell. And Dante was quite interested in that. He mentions in various letters and in various of his writings, and of course also in the Divine Comedy, various crusaders quite favorably, and he also mentions that his own great-grandfather was one of the people participating in the First Crusade, Cacciagida, his name. And in a sense, the failure of the crusading project, as some cultural historians have shown, chiefly R.W. Southern here at Oxford some 50 years ago, is that it was part of the inception of the Renaissance, in the sense that it started to transform the idea of an imminent eschaton, an imminent universal plan that would bring deliverance through essentially a crusading project, into a more pessimistic view of salvation, and therefore a greater interest in political theory and in sort of this world rather than the next. And this interest, of course, lined up nicely with the struggle between papacy and empire that we've talked about, and it showed itself chiefly in the sort of rediscovery or representation of Roman law in Italy at the time. There is a sort of interplay here that at the same time the interest in Roman law propelled ideas that were both among canon lawyers as well as among secular lawyers on the imperial side, but also that the revival of Roman law, which is so crucial to what we call the Renaissance, the revival of classical ideas, was actively perpetuated by people working at a place such as Bologna, founded by the emperors, as a means to counter the canon law of the Pope. So we see a sort of competition here and a conscious recovery of the corpus studied at imperial behest. You might be familiar with Gratian's Decretum of 1140, that kind of first codified, again, the CIC, the Corpus Juris Civilis, from Justinian's times. And this is really where we see the emergence of political theory out of jurisprudence, out of the idea at the time of jus commune, sort of proto-natural law, you could say, combining Roman and canon law to be uncovered by legal scholars rather than to be posited by sovereigns. So there was this idea that Roman law has some objective quality and exists out there, and the lawyer is not the one just interpreting what the sovereign puts forward, but almost a scientist, a philosopher, uncovering Platonic truths of law. Now Dante himself, we don't know whether he studied law, but he certainly studied the ars dictandi, and every student of that art acquired some legal knowledge as part of the trivium and the quadrivium of education at the time. And he accurately cites Roman and canon laws in the Monarchia. And that is the cue to move on to the actual text. Here you see the first page of the first printed edition of the Monarchia. That was printed in the 16th century. If we have time later on to talk about reception, we might get a bit into that. And the Monarchia was written, it's not quite clear. It was basically, some historians say it was written in 1315, but certainly no earlier than that. And others interpret it to have been in 1317, 18, shortly before his death. But what matters is that it was clearly well into the Avignon papacy and well after the visit of Henry of Luxembourg to Italy. Now the Monarchia is obviously far well less known than the Divine Comedy. We mustn't give ourselves to any illusions regarding that. It's written in Latin, as you can see. Sometimes you forget to mention the most obvious, even though Dante is known as the father of Italian. He wrote this treatise in Latin. And on the other hand, I think it's important to think that even though in hindsight, we know that the Monarchia didn't circulate in too many manuscripts. We've only got 20 total, plus 2 that were recently in fragments discovered here at Bodleian. But still, even though it can't in its circulation compete at all with the Divina Commedia, at the time there is good evidence that actually Dante himself, on his circle, considered this as much to be his important work as the Divine Comedy. His good friend, the Bolognese law professor, Giovanni del Virgilio, one of the leading Roman lawyers at the time, wrote an epigraph just after Dante's death in his memory, where he calls him qui loca defunctis gladiisque regnumque gemellis. So to the dead he assigned their places, and to the twin swords their kingdoms. Now the dead their places, of course, alludes to the Divina Commedia, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, features the dead and their various places in Purgatory and Paradise and Hell. But then also to the twin swords their kingdoms, which alludes to the Gelasian theory of the separation of church and state. So in the words of his sort of best friend and co-worker at the time, these two texts have equal weight. And we must assume, in absence of evidence to the contrary, that this was so to Dante himself as well. Now, the Monarchia is divided into 3 chapters, and each chapter goes into detail on one proposition. The first book presents the question on whether universal monarchy or empire is necessary. So these are my titles. This is not Dante's title. I just try to sum it up in an easy way. The second book concerns the question of legitimacy, whether the monarchy was acquired by the Roman people by right or by force, which of course Dante argues the former. And the third book, that it was directly bequeathed to the Romans by God and not through the vicar, which of course refers to the Pope. And to move on to the first book of necessity, I knew this was going to happen at some point. Here we go. Dante introduces this contribution to political theory first by pointing out the duty one has to improving the lives of future generations, just as previous generations have done for us. An emphasis on heritage is unmistakable here. He argues that politics is a new, almost untested field of inquiry, which I find quite interesting to read, because it really it sounds like something that a modern historian would say, looking at the time, as I've just spoken about the emergence of political theory from jurisprudence. But Dante is actually conscious of that and sees himself as someone following an art that doesn't have a name yet, because there is no such idea as political philosophy, and he actually is conscious of that. Now, as in any sound Aristotelian inquiry, as of course Dante wants to write, you must begin with first principles. And the first principle that Dante certainly starts with in the first book of the Monarchia, otherwise his reflections would be based on nothing, is the principle of peace. Now, as Aquinas, whom Dante mentions a lot in the text and has a kind of ambivalent relationship with, has famously proven, or believed to have proven, is that the first principles, in this case of politics, which is a province of practical reason rather than theoretical, must begin with the ends of practical action rather than just the means. And if we want to ground ourselves in arche, in a first principle in the Aristotelian sense, we must begin with the telos. And the telos is peace, as Dante writes, universal peace is the best of all things which are directed or ordered towards human happiness, pax ministerium felicitatis. Now, the word that he then uses to describe peace is not just pax, but also concordia, and drawn from Aristotelian metaphysics, goodness being expressed in the totality of the universe. There's a famous passage in the 12th book of the Metaphysics, some people may be familiar with it. He summarizes that this concordia, this sort of form of peace between people, has a duplex ordo, has a twin nature. One is the unity between human beings, and the other is the unity of these people under a ruler. There are 2 kinds of order, quoting Dante, observable in things, namely the order which relates part to part, and the order which relates the parts of some other entity, which is not a part, just as the component parts of an army are interrelated to one another, and they are related to their commander. As you can see here, I put the Latin up. There is a very interesting piece there, because it is, are there any international, or let's say modern public international lawyers here? Not quite. If there were, they might be familiar with the principle par imparem non habet imperio, which is usually expressed as the principle of sovereignty nowadays, that between equals there cannot be one ruling over the other. Fascinatingly, this is actually, as far as I understand, a principle first formulated in Dante. as you can see. Obviously, in the Monarchia, Dante was arguing for the very opposite of what we would see as a principle of sovereignty. But still, somehow, this ended up being a famous principle of public international law. So if anyone wants to write a history of international law, a treatise on that, that'd be very interesting to understand the provenance of this post-Westphalian principle of state immunity in Dante's De Monarchia. Now, the idea is based on this principle, et cum altere altero cognoscere non possit, ex quo alter alteri non subtitur, namquam parem non habet imperium, that since neither can judge the other, if you have two monarchs, that any proper provision of peace cannot be but universal. And here Dante is really engaging, I would say, implicitly with Aquinas again, with De Regno, because in Aquinas De Regno, he has a very similar idea of what a king should do, but the secular ends are subordinated to the spiritual, and the king's underneath the Pope. But he implicitly criticizes Aquinas in saying that you would always have competition between one ruler and the other, when one is not subject to the other's control. Yeah. And next to peace, as the sort of means towards the telos of peace, Dante posits justice. This is a very interesting thing that links us for the first time now to the Divine Comedy, because justice is personified here, as you can say, praetereat mundus optimi dispositus est. I'll read the translation. Furthermore, the world is ordered in the best possible way when justice is at its strongest in it. Thus Virgil, who I'm sure anyone who's read the Divine Comedy knows is basically Dante's end-all and be-all, wishing to praise the age which seemed to be emergent in his day, sang in his eclogues, or rather his bucolics, now the Virgin returns, the reign of Saturn returns. Iam reditet Virgo, redium Saturnia regna, the famous image that he writes about the Augustan age. And then he explains, like a proper humanist, for the Virgin was their name for justice, whom they also called Astrea. The reign of Saturn was their name for the best of times, which they also called golden. So here we see that Dante's serious engagement with Virgil's works leads to him interpreting justice through the lenses of Virgil and giving it this name of Virgo, or as we see in later scholarship, Astrea, the Virgo Astrea, symbolizing justice. The passage from the Divine Comedy from Purgatory is also here. Again, I will read the translation for the benefit of those who are not Italian or Latin inclined. This is in the 12th book of Purgatory when he talks to Virgil. You were as one goes by night, carrying the light behind him. It is no help to him, but instructs all those who follow. When you said, and again this is the same, but this time in Italian translation, the centuries turn new again. Justice returns with the first age of man, and new progeny descends from heaven. Now this passage is usually interpreted in the Divine Comedy as him claiming that Virgil, with his fourth eclogue, was really writing about the coming of Jesus. And thereby, interestingly, he kind of explains why Virgil, even though he's a pagan, or justifies why Virgil, even though he's a pagan, is in purgatory and has some special place to play in plan for salvation. But when we look at this in regards to the mention in the Monarchia of also this Virgo, there's a separate interpretation of it, namely that Virgil is not just a prophet of, a sort of premature prophet of Christianity, but also a premature prophet of universal empire. Right. And Virgil closes the first book by describing, again, Concordia, the peace in this world, as the unity of wills amongst human beings, ensured by being organized under a single ruler. As it reads in chapter 15 of book 1, all concord depends on the unity which is in wills. Humankind in its ideal state represents a kind of concord, for just as one man in his ideal state spiritually and physically is a kind of concord, so is the whole of humankind, and thus the whole of humankind in its ideal state depends on the unity which is in human wills. But this cannot be unless there is one will which controls and directs all the others towards one goal. And Ernst Kantorowicz, one of the first modern interpreters of the Monarchia, calls this Dante's anthropocentric kingship. So in a sense, the kingship that is oriented towards people towards people having the proper relationship towards each other, because they first need to have the proper relationship to kingship. The second book of the De Monarchia, now concerned with the principle of legitimacy, after Dante believes he has proven the necessity of universal empire as the means for universal peace. He now turns to history and a rather detailed investigation of the ancient Roman past to prove why the Roman Empire acquired this kingship, this empire. And it's important to note that he doesn't really make a distinction between kingship and empire, because monarchia, which we now understand to mean monarchy and therefore associated with kingship, in the literal sense means, of course, singular rule, and therefore actually is the term he uses for empire. So sometimes there may be some confusion in the translation here. How does he prove that Romans acquired their rule? By virtue of law and justice rather than force. He reminds us that he, as a young man himself, has undergone a change of heart when it comes to the Roman Empire. He used to see Rome, as he says, as a large band of robbers, which is an allusion to Augustine's Civitas Dei, right? You may be familiar. There's probably a lot of people here far more familiar with Augustine than I could ever be. But as I learned, there is a reference here to Augustine's mentioning a pirate being dragged before Alexander the Great and asking Alexander the Great, what is the difference between you and me? Remove justice, and what are kingdoms but bands of robbers on a large scale? Now, interestingly, of course, Augustine, when he writes this in the Civitas Dei, shows a profound uneasiness and a profound, you could say, epistemological humility as to the possible ends of temporal rule. Because when Augustine equates Alexander with a pirate, he's probably hinting at the pirate, the Alexander, having no possibility to really provide peace, because peace can only be in the city of God, right? But Dante, it is rather the opposite, that he says he changed his mind about this and then saw that Roman imperial rule really came about by use, not vis. Yes. Now, Dante here lays out veritas autem questionis patere, this one. The truth of the matter can be real not only by light of human reason, but also by the radiance of divine authority. When these two are in agreement, heaven and earth must of necessity both give their assent. Now he claims that the Roman Empire acquired its imperium, not by force but by right, and that this is discernible not just by human reason but by divine authority. And obviously these should be about the same thing. So here we are reminded of the Euthyphro Dilemma, which Dante probably did not know because it wasn't translated yet. But obviously he answers in the affirmative that whatever is divine will is also good. And he has a really peculiar and one could say strange almost, at least to me it seems very strange, and I'm sure to Christians in this room it will seem very strange, idea on how to prove that it was indeed divine will that the Roman Empire acquired its authority. Quod autem pro Romano imperio perficiendo miracula Deus portenderet, I'll read the translation, that God performed miracles so that the Roman Empire might be supreme is confirmed by the testimony of illustrious authors. For Livy tells in the first part of his work that in the time of Numa Pompilius, the second king of the Romans, a shield fell from heaven into God's chosen city as he was sacrificing ritu gentilium, according to pagan rite. And so really, and this brings us back to what I said earlier about Virgil's role in the Divine Comedy as the ultimate martyr, as a pagan that lit the way for Christianity, and therefore in some sense is almost as holy or even holier than a Christian. That here Dante is essentially saying that the veneration of pagan gods by the Romans was an indirect veneration of God who performed miracles for them. Interesting theology hidden behind this, but it seems sufficient to him. No. Confusion in the papers. And the second part of this argument is that just as anyway, it doesn't matter, I'll just read it out, that just as in Jesus being born in the reign of Caesar means also that, in a sense, there is an implicit are sent to Roman imperial authority in the plan for salvation, in the Christian plan for salvation, because otherwise he couldn't have been judged by imperial authority, or just as Paul also wanted to be rendered unto imperial authority. All in all, he concludes that that imperial authority was not just by vis, but also by use. Now last, we move on to the third book of Immediacy, and in which Dante sets out to prove that the authority does not derive from the papacy, or doesn't derive through the papacy. Now, we already mentioned the Gelasian formula that was usually prominent in the Middle Ages, passed down since the 5th century, and in which the sort of auctoritas sacrata and the regalis potestas were separated, the idea of sacred and of royal power. But in this Gelasian formula, usually the kings, the emperors and kings still depended in spiritual matters on the Pope. And Dante sets out to disprove that, in a sense, and already starts in the very first chapter of Book 3 by then comparing himself to Daniel in the lion's den. As you can see, conclusit ora leonum et non loquerum mihi. So, like Daniel, he will shut the lion's mouths. And that veritas, the truth, quia sine rubora aliquorum emergere nequit. But to have truth emerge, you cannot quite live without shaming or embarrassing some people. And it's not without reason that he starts saying that, but we will get to that in a bit. First, we have the most crucial passage, the most crucial Aristotelian logical passage of the proof of the necessity of Roman Empire preceding the papacy, and because this is the most crucial point, I've put a translation up here, usually otherwise assuming that people know Latin, but maybe in this case not. Namely that if the church is A and the emperor is B, the authority of C, and then if when A didn't exist yet, when C was in B, and he's here alluding, of course, and kind of refuting, because this is before Lorenzo Valla proves the dedonation of Constantine, that allegedly assigned power to the papacy from the Roman Empire was a fraud. So he tries to instead argue against the donation of Constantine, saying that essentially, well, the Roman Empire preceded Christianity and preceded the church. We've just seen in Book 2 while the Roman Empire was just and not just ruling by force, and therefore, how could possibly the empire B derive its C, its authority, from A when both of them preceded A? That is essentially a nice Aristotelian syllogism that I suppose you can't really argue with unless you argue that the Roman Empire didn't have legitimate authority. In all of this, we see an interesting question, and that's the view of the papacy, and really the crux of my argument, how we should read this text. That looking at it so far, you could think that really there's a quite low opinion of the papacy, and that would accord with some of the things we see in the Divine Comedy. In one of the most famous passages, we see Dante and Virgil in the Divine Comedy in Inferno, in Hell, encountering the popes that were suffering for simony, for selling offices of the church. Out from the mouth of each hole there emerged a sinner's feet, and so much of his legs up to the thigh, the rest remained within. And he, one of the sinners, cried out, "Are you already standing there, O Boniface? The book has lied to me by several years." It becomes clear that the Pope, Nicholas Orsini, already being in there, suffering for simony, he's kind of alluded, his name isn't mentioned, but he's called the son of the she-bear, an allusion to the name Orsini in Italian, can see the future like all the damned, and he believes Dante to be Boniface, the Pope, still alive when Dante writes this, and alludes to his also being damned and on the way to hell. And that's of course quite something to see the papacy as so sinful that they are bound to end up in hell. On the other hand, we have another passage in the Purgatory where he refers to the slap of Anagni that I mentioned before, and which goes, "I see the fleur-de-lis enter Anagni, and in his vicar Christ made captive. A second time I see him mocked, I see the vinegar and gall renewed, I see him slain between the living thieves." So quite an outrage actually at this slap of Anagni. And the focus of the idea here being that there is a separation between really the papacy as an office and the person of Boniface VIII specifically at first, and then the Avignon popes at second. As we see here, at the time that was not a singular occurrence. That it's not something we only find in Dante. It's actually quite common among Italians at the time to have a low view of the popes sitting in Avignon for maybe practical reasons. We see, for example, in one Italian manuscript, Rome represented as a widow grieving for the absent papacy in Avignon. But I think it's really important to remember that these attacks on these specific popes are as much about those popes having sold out the church as they are about trying to sort of subordinating the church to the empire. And that we don't really see Dante as an anti-papist, but rather as someone who believes that those specific popes have upset the order of the church. Now, to conclude the discussion of the Monarchia, really, Dante has a, where am I now? I got lost. Nope. All right, that's the problem with, yeah, here we go. To conclude the discussion of the Monarchia, I think it's interesting to think of his view of humanity. So we've had in the first book the conclusion that there is this double order of humankind, in a sense, which interestingly kind of aligns with what Kant was later to write in his idea of a universal history on the cosmopolitan plan, one of the more basics of modern cosmopolitanism, of a sort of function of humankind as striving towards production of culture and art, unimpeded by warfare and strife, as the goal of peace. And I think that would be something I would like to focus on in medieval, to understand how much these ideas might have influenced even later thinkers such as Kant. But in Dante, I think it's important to recognize that this idea of the dual end of humanity maps up nicely with the dual nature of humanity as proposed by Aquinas, and Dante uses it to argue also for the dual nature of rule, right? The emperor who's imperiatus and the pope who's papatus. This is a nice little diagram taken from Kantorowicz's study on Dante. And here we really see what's truly revolutionary in my view about this text, namely that when Dante writes that two ends have been set by providence, that ineffable before man to be contemplated by him, the blessedness, to wit, of this life, which consists in the exercise of man's proper power and is figured by the terrestrial paradise, and the blessedness of eternal life, which consists in the fruition of the divine aspect, to which his power may not ascend unless assisted by the divine light. And this blessedness is given to be understood by the celestial paradise. This reading is supported by a passage from Purgatory. Again, I'm trying to kind of show that these are really two expressions of the same political thought, or philosophical thought. She, maker of the good world Rome, soleva Roma, was wont to having two sons, which made plain to sight both one road and the other, world and God. So really, I believe that his conclusion is that the offices of Pope and Emperor, being separate, have both separate predestined ends assigned by providence. So when some scholarship interprets especially that towards the turn of the last century that tries to use the Monarchia as the origin of maybe global institutions and institutions such as the United Nations, when they interpret this as a secular text, I think there is a mistake in, but maybe also an unconsciously appropriate description, because it certainly isn't secular, because the argument uses divine providence, but it's secular in the sense that it's concerned with this world rather than the next. And so what all the criticism we see of the papacy is the criticism for meddling in this world, not a criticism of the papacy and institution, for sort of not focusing on its predestined end towards the spiritual nature of man, but instead actually abandoning that for politics. Because a duality of goals doesn't necessarily, in the Aristotelian sense, imply a conflict of loyalties or even an antithesis. There's no antithesis between human and Christian at all in the work of Dante, who wrote as a Christian and addressed himself to Christian society, but rather the antithesis is only between two modes of rule, and as long as everyone sticks to their modes of rule, and they are assigned ends for human felicity, then actually Dante sees both positively. Now, this metaphysical surgery exceeded that of all other thinkers on the separation of the scepters before, in my view, because it really takes them apart and sees them as different ends for humanity. And it is inspired partially also, when we think of the common purpose of mankind and the development of civilization, by what his detractors have called Averroism. And now Dante was certainly an Averroist in that he read Averroes, and he was intrigued by the idea of a common intellectual soul, a oneness towards which people's intellect strives. But on the other hand, he's not an Averroist in the sense that maybe his detractors claimed him to be, namely denying the singularness of the human soul. He doesn't really concern himself too much with that. And I think it is ultimately his most original accomplishment that he separated humanitas sort of from Christianitas. And Pius is probably going to ask a question very soon in the Q&A about that, so I'm not going into the question of other faiths here yet. But he took sort of human and Christian and made them separate but coexisting concepts. Now, to conclude, the question is Dante's work then, which we see as, it's the manuscript I didn't show. Anyway, here you can see the wonderful manuscript that was just 2 years ago discovered in the Bodleian, which is a commentary on Dante's Monarchia by Cola di Rienzo, an interesting figure in his own right. Should have shown you that before, but didn't. But to conclude, the author Dante has such a multifaceted reception. The Monarchia was used by Protestants in the 16th century to argue against the papacy. That's why the first edition was printed in the 16th century in Basel. That's what we started with. It was used by Catholics such as Mercurio di Gattinara, the Chancellor of Charles V, to argue for the necessity of the supremacy of one emperor over his Protestant and Catholic foes. It was then used at the turn of the 19th century, when suddenly many translations of this text emerged by American cosmopolitans to argue for the necessity of world government. And as we've heard initially, it was also popular among those who founded the UN to argue for sort of the necessity of a secular world government. So you can in some sense say that this is one of those instances of the death of the author, that maybe Dante himself didn't matter as much. But on the other hand, I think it's important to remember that the history that actually occurred is, at least when we want to do intellectual history, only half of the game. When Dante was writing, he couldn't know that his project of reinstituting Restitutio Imperii would never come to pass. And if we can allow ourselves to be a bit Aristotelian ourselves as historians, then the ends towards which people were writing are just as important as the means, in a sense. And the other important thing that I draw out of this is that, well, cosmopolitanism in the broader sense of the world is not as modern and contingent on the expansion of the worldview with the great discoveries as it's usually assumed to be. But on the other hand, actually also that the imperial kingship of the sovereign state, what Weber calls the rational versus the traditional state, in a sense maps on very nicely to all these Dantesque arguments. And all these, and the great theorists of the modern state and of the monopoly of violence within the modern state, and I'm thinking of course of people like Hobbes in the early modern age, were very much familiar with treatises that came about in the context of the court of Charles V, which were taken by, translated into English and many other languages, and taken by, for example, in England, the court of Elizabeth I, to kind of imperialize the kingship and at the same time localize the imperial and argue for the absolute power of the monarch, rex imperator in regno suo, as it was formulated at the time. There is some great research on that done by Francis Yates, Astrea, the imperial theme in the 16th century, and I think if one were to write a study linking up these late medieval ideas of universal monarchy with early modern ideas of absolute power of kingship, one would find that they are much more close to each other and much more similar than it is maybe assumed at first glance. The one is horizontal and the other is vertical, but both use the same arguments. And just like these two, much debate on modern issues between national and global seems to kind of miss the point that this rational state is a vertical conception of the imperial. For example, when we have debates on Brexit, on decolonization, and so forth on both sides of the political aisle, there is often, in my view, a lack of awareness that actually the national state is in a sense just as imperial, and on the other hand, the imperial state is often not as imperial as the national in its absolute control. So if we take seriously Straussian critique of the assumption of historical contingency of all intellectual work, of all political theory, then I suppose we end with a plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. People thought of the same issues in the 14th century as we are today, and we still haven't really resolved them. And in fact, there isn't really a solution. So we expect these institutions to provide global governance without solving Dante's main argument, namely that if there's two equals, there will always be competition between them, and none will control the other. Thank you very much, and I hope we have time for questions.